to segue now into Chapter 10 because of suppressed incomes.
Right.
We have in the next chapter a focus on the fact that federal and state labor market policies with undisguised racial intent depressed African American wages. The wealth gap between blacks and whites didn't just happen, it was created by government policies that purposefully kept black incomes low through most of the 20th century. And now those economic differences have become self-perpetuating.
They started out by talking about, in the post-Civil War era,
yes.
talking about sharecropping and indentured servitude. Basically, it was just another word for slavery. Because they had no hope of getting out. In fact, in many of these situations, at the end of the month, they owed more money to the owner of the property than they made.
And what happens if they try to suddenly leave?
They couldn't leave because you could be you'd be arrested.
Police involvement again.
Police involvement again. You'd be arrested for leaving because you left owing these people money. Because every month you stayed there, you owed them more money, so you never could get away.
And you're still kind of considered owned then.
After they arrested you for trying to get away, they would arrest you, and then the warden would sell you to other plantations, mines, factories to work as a prisoner.
You could even get arrested for loitering in downtown areas and imprisoned.
And then sold to the local factory owner to work for them for not enough money to ever amount to anything, basically. So slavery, actual slavery, there's no other term for it, was still occurring. That was happening in the post-Civil War, but also right up into the early 1900s.
Well, it was the practice of sharecropping wasn't outlawed until 1951.
Right. Although it was interesting that he used the term that some African Americans managed to escape to the north early in the 20th century. And that was part of the first Great Migration of World War I. And I thought it was interesting to say that they thought they escaped. I had visions of the Underground Railroad and slaves trying to get away from their masters and the plantations in the South. So to think that even in the early 1900s, African Americans were still trying to escape.
They're still escaping all the way up until the 1950s. And so you talked about the first Great Migration. The wars brought two huge migrations.
Right.
World War I and then World War II was the second one. And the author talks about how the most devastating impacts when it comes to income for African Americans in this country was World War II, when African Americans were excluded from all of the enormous surge in war-related jobs and then jobs for post-war residential and highway construction booms. All the federal contracts that were going to discriminatory unions where the unions were all white, a person couldn't get a referral for any of these jobs without the union, and the union would not hire African Americans for the most part, and when they did, it was always for the lowest paying menial jobs.
One of the things we talked about earlier was the fact that one of the things that happened during World War II was that we found for the first time ever white workers and African American workers side by side in the plants working together and finding out that maybe they weren't so different after all. Maybe I could rely upon this guy to do his job, which affected how I did my job. That was the beginning of good integration. Although it didn't go into the homes, it didn't go into where you could live. And that was kind of frustrating even for some of the white workers to find out that their African American co-workers couldn't live in the same areas that they lived in. We had the effect of people trying to fight that sort of segregation. However, even though they were working next to each other in the plant and getting along, they were very differently paid.
Well, also, Michael, from everything we've read in this chapter, though, it sounds like those examples were more anomalies than the standard. Most of the time, they were not working side by side. They were, at best, out of all those union jobs, 90% of them were white, and the few that actually got into those companies were given janitorial type of work. Let me share. I just want to talk about, like, how many jobs are we talking about right here? You know what I mean? Like in the country for these booms. They talk about how marine laborers went from seven marine laborers before the federal government started giving out war contracts to 30,000.
Right, and that was in the West Coast.
And then
That was
steam
in
fitters, yes.
the Bay Area.
400 to 17,000. This is a huge opportunity across the country for employment and higher training and to raise your quality of life and wages, but really just open to primarily white workers.
The unions became prominent from my own growing up experience in Detroit, where the auto workers, obviously, the UAW was gigantic. Walter Reuther was the head of the UAW when I was growing up. They fought very hard to get into the auto companies. Ford was the last of the companies to put them off. They didn't get into Ford until years after they got into Chrysler and General Motors. But we're talking about the 30s, early 30s into late 30s. The unions were starting to get into the auto plants in the early 30s. They didn't get into Ford until the late 30s. So by the time the war came along, the unions were pretty well established in all those areas. The auto workers were probably better equipped for integration during that period of time in the war because the UAW was part of the CIO. The AFL was more conservative, and they didn't integrate until far later than the CIO did. So the UAW was part of the CIO, so I think there was probably better integration there. But even in those systems, there was still difference in pay. We talked about the shipbuilders. They finally said, we have to let African American people in. We have to let black workers in because we don't have enough white workers. So we will create a separate union for them, a separate division within the union for black workers, where you can pay your dues and you can get these menial jobs that we need to have taken care of. But you can't vote and you can't file a grievance. You have no rights, but we'll let you get involved. And that was only as a last resort. In fact, an awful lot of these things where the breakthroughs finally came through was right at the end of the war, and there weren't any jobs left anyway.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back. We're skipping over some stuff.
Okay.
So I want to talk about how did this happen? Because we are involving, these are federal government contracts. How is this allowed? Again, we're back to de jure segregation. So the author talks about Roosevelt's 1930s New Deal.
Right.
And as someone who's involved in a lot of politics and legislation, I relate to this, and unfortunately is more familiar to me than I wish it was. But how the sausage is made and the concessions that are given, and how we can tell ourselves, or legislators tell themselves, that the end justifies the means. And so the author talks about how in the New Deal, the protection for African Americans was stripped out in order to get it passed, but with the knowledge then that they would be excluded from protections for all of the things such as Social Security, minimum wage, maximum hours, and that for all of the better professions would receive those protections, but they would be excluded for professions such as agriculture and domestic service, where African Americans could primarily find employment. And there are several examples. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration program in 1933 disproportionately spent funds on unemployed whites. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a program designed to help build skill sets in young people, but this program refused to permit African Americans most of the time. And when they were brought in, they were only given the least skilled jobs, least opportunity for training, and paid them less than what was the stipulated wage.
And no opportunity for advancement.
And
in all those New Deal programs, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the National Recovery Administration, as you said, the Civilian Conservation Corps, we've seen these as the TVA and the NRA and the CCC, and we hear all these things about how we got out of the Depression from all these programs. But it didn't help
whites did.
But it didn't help African Americans. It didn't help black families at all.
And then there was the 1935 National Labor Relations Act that Roosevelt signs, allowing unions to bargain with management, but without the protections for African Americans. For the next 30 years, the government protected bargaining rights of unions that denied African Americans privileges of membership and segregated them again into menial jobs or subsets of the unions, like you said, where they were required to pay dues without any of the union protections of being able to have advancement or file grievances or vote.
Yeah.
I think about protests in this country and sometimes the attitude our country has when people finally get so fed up that they start to protest. Why do they need to do that? Why do they need to take to the streets? And a prime example was mentioned in this book in the fact that there was about to be a march on Washington, D.C. And in order to avoid it, Roosevelt promises and creates this Fair Employment Practices Committee to stave off the protests, but is essentially useless. A completely toothless committee that whenever they even do make a recommendation, it's just completely ignored across the country.
We always heard about how inclusive it was and how open to minorities. And the reality was it paid lip service to it, but it didn't really make any effective changes. And even the programs that he brought in, FHA is one of his biggest programs, 1934, completely, openly, systematically, the purpose was not to allow, not only did they not allow provide loans or back loans to black families, black home buyers, they wouldn't fund loans to integrated neighborhoods, whether you were white or black. You couldn't possibly have been more segregationist than the FHA, which was designed to help people get into homes. No, it was designed to help white people get into homes. And I think probably a lot of this stuff, frankly, Eleanor, she would badger Franklin to the point where he just gave in on things. And I think a lot of this stuff was Eleanor Roosevelt, who I think had much more of a liberal relationship with people of America than Franklin did. And I think a lot of it was her influence on him. And then he would pay lip service to her by saying, oh yeah, we're going to do this and do that. But then when push came to shove, they didn't back it up. They didn't support it.
So again, we have all these programs, right? We won the war. It's an important thing. We needed to build up and be able to put on a good war effort. And during the Depression and post-war, we needed to rebuild our country. There were a lot of programs, like you said, that helped do that. But if you try to compare it to running a race, you put all of the white people and the black people on the line, and you fired the starting gun, and you let all of the white people have a 30-year advance, head start, to get ahead, while telling all of the black people in the country they had to stay exactly where they are. And when you look around our country today, you can't deceive yourself anymore about the reasons why there is such an enormous economic gap between white people and African Americans. You mentioned Sausalito, which was the shipyards, and a great example of the court case where they were going to fire all of them because they refused to pay the dues. But again, the author does a great job of making the case that this is not an isolated incident. The same things were happening in St. Louis, Los Angeles, Seattle, Kansas City. All of these unions are in non-compliance with the president's non-discrimination order, and I do air quotes on that, but never impacting the federal contracts that they enjoyed. That's during the war. So then there's the case of like, well, what do you want him to do, right? Like, we're in the middle of a war. We have to get this stuff done. But there was no recourse after the war either for all of the injustices and discrimination that was occurring. There was the GI Bill. The VA not only denied African Americans mortgage subsidies, like you said, but they frequently restricted education and training to lower level jobs. They'd even dishonorably discharge a black person for protesting segregation in army towns. They talk about the famous Boilermakers. 70% of all the shipyard workers were in this union that would not enroll African Americans until they were desperate for workers, putting them in menial jobs and forcing them to pay dues. Their fringe benefits were half of what the white members were, and they couldn't be promoted if it involved supervising whites. This was the same instance for 29 of the national unions. It was 1972, and then another 10 years before African Americans are admitted to the AFL unions. But then they faced seniority rules. So you were talking about the differences between the various unions. So finally they get allowed to be admitted into some of these unions, but they can't advance because you have this long line of whites who all have seniority over them.
The big housing boom, the post-war housing boom, that was huge for white families, or for white GIs, and not for black GIs. In fact, not only were they not allowed to participate in acquiring housing in these new tracts that were put up, they weren't even allowed to work to get jobs in building them. And you said before about the GI Bill being discriminatory. They weren't allowing black GIs to attend four-year schools. They were being rerouted into trade schools. The rate of dishonorable discharges from the services was twice as high for black soldiers and sailors as it was for white soldiers and sailors, because you said they could be dishonorable discharged just for objecting to the fact that they weren't receiving fair treatment. Ironically, one of the soldiers that was arrested and tried in a general court-martial was Jackie Robinson, who was the first baseball player to break the color barrier with the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was found not guilty, probably because of his already growing status as an athlete, as a recognizable athlete. And you think about this, if he had been found guilty and was dishonorable discharged, he never would have made it into the baseball leagues. That would have changed history significantly, that one little thing that was allowed. But again, he received special treatment because of his skills as a prominent ball player. Not everybody had that good fortune to be separated out and treated a little bit differently because of that. So there were a lot of people that were dishonorable discharge, something that follows you for the rest of your life, and not in a good way. No.
After serving and making it home alive, to be met with that. So.
And what was Jackie Robinson's? What was his crime that he was being court-martialed for with the possibility of a dishonorable discharge? He sat in the wrong part of a bus, of a military bus. He sat in the wrong part of a military bus. For that minor infraction, he could have ended up with his entire life being different.
We're at a point where we watch the federal government create one of the largest economic boons in our country, for which the vast majority of African Americans are prohibited from benefiting and participating in. In those rare instances where African American families have been able to scrape together enough money to be able to purchase a home in an area where you're not having a huge depreciating value and blight, you find the government finding another new tactic of de jure segregation through discriminatory property assessments.
The concept that, the appraiser came through and just said that my house is worth this much money. Oh my gosh, that's fantastic. Look, I only paid this much for it. Look how much my property is assessed at now. I've gained income, right? Exactly. No, I'm paying higher taxes. That's what it comes down to, because an assessment, a tax assessor's evaluation of your property, as we all know in real estate, has no basis in what your property is actually worth. It's what your property is going to be taxed at. That has no impact on what it's going to be worth. And because I have no idea, I know what I'm being taxed at, but I have no idea what you're being taxed at, we don't even know enough to complain. Because we don't recognize that this is being done under the table, so to speak, that I'm being taxed at a higher rate than my white neighbor. You think, well, my house must be worth a lot more than his then, right? That's great. I have more equity in my home now. No, you don't.
And most of the time, you don't even know what the assessments are in the neighborhood next year.
No.
It's not a transparent process, but the author does provide some decent research for whatever was out there to make the case for this. He talks about a 1962 investigation in Boston that showed assessments at 68% of market value for the black neighborhoods, but only 41% for the white neighborhoods. In 1973, there's a HUD study showing systematic pattern of overassessment in low-income African American neighborhoods and underassessments in white neighborhoods that the study concludes cannot be explained by anything other than intentional violation of constitutional protections by assessors. Yet the U.S. Department of Justice ignores the study. And then in 1979, so we started out with a 1962 Boston study, and now we're at a 1979 study, an instance where Mayor Daley's Chicago neighborhood where he lived, 50% lower than the legally prescribed ratio, and a nearby African American neighborhood was 200% higher than the allowed ratio. And the author has found instances of this occurring in Albany, Boston, Buffalo, Fort Worth, Norwalk, Baltimore, Philadelphia, all of which African Americans never knew it was happening.
And I think you can extend that to every city in America. That's happening in every city in America. Now, the idea that Mayor Daley's neighborhood was being assessed at 50%, where the nearby African American neighbors were 200%. I'm old enough to remember Mayor Daley being the king of Chicago, one of the most racist leaders America has ever produced, corrupt at every level. Those were the years where...
Well, he's got some competition now, but...
He has significant competition in today's world, which is unfortunate because you'd think he would leave those things behind. Mayor Orville Hubbard in Dearborn, Michigan, was exactly the same. He was like Mayor Daley's little brother as far as all the things that were happening there. And those two weren't unique. They were just high profiles, what was going on in the rest of the country. And you think, well, at least those days are behind us. Unfortunately, they're not.
So unfortunately, the consequence of these overassessments of black neighborhoods didn't just mean they were paying higher property taxes. The real result was that these high assessments, well, remember, let's go back to previous chapters, they first had to way overpay for the value of the home just to be able to get into it. So their mortgage rates are enormous. Now they have assessments that are much higher also than their white counterparts, and it also translates into higher rents. And it ends up spurring neighborhood deterioration.
Because there's no money left to take care of your property.
Yeah.
First of all, you're earning less than the comparable job that the white person's doing.
Yeah.
Second of all, you're being taxed at significantly higher levels. There's no money left to take care of the property.
Not only can you not take care of the property, but you now have African Americans who have been put by these policies into a much greater probability of being delinquent on their property taxes, making them prey to speculators when they fall behind in tax payments. We missed one, Michael. We missed one. Not only do they have lower incomes and jobs, higher mortgage payments because they had to overpay for the house, higher taxes, but they're also oftentimes located far outside where the employment centers are, so they also have higher transportation costs driving back and forth.
Right.
And when they finally end up potentially being delinquent on their property taxes, you had speculators being able to come in, pay off whatever was due on the property tax bill, and take over the lien of the property and evict them.
And ironically, those kinds of things have continued on, not just against black families, but against everybody until just recently. Just a recent Supreme Court case just basically took away an awful lot of those rights. I'm talking last year Supreme Court case that addressed these issues with regard to equity theft through tax foreclosures. But that was happening back then primarily against black families because they were the ones that were falling behind with their taxes because taxes were higher. They were making less money. They had more expenses. They paid more for the house than they should to begin with. All those kind of things. In fact, it was interesting. I thought it was interesting here that some of the landlords were evicting their white tenants because they could get four times the rent from a black tenant. So they're kicking out the white guys so they can rent to the black guys. They think, well, that's a positive move, right? No, it's because they can get 4 times the rent from the black family than they can from the white family.
I wish we had more time because the author gives a lot of really startling stories and examples. Don't just listen to us, you should be reading the book. But at the end of the day, the limited access to housing options and the limited opportunities for jobs and advancement and higher pay created prime opportunity for exploitation of African Americans throughout the 20th century. And I wrote something in my notes, Michael. Another way of putting this, when you deny African Americans the ability to have federally backed jobs and federally backed protections in your jobs, and you deny them the ability to have subsidies that whites are able to get, for instance, at FHA or VA loans or the GI Bills to be able to get better education, when you are taxing them more than white people simply because they're African American and you can get away with it. All of the dollars, like if you were to get your calculator up and started adding this up, we stole from them. We stole. Our government stole real money, generation after generation, out from them.
They certainly had a harder row to hoe than the white people did.
An impossible row to hoe. There's no way you could succeed, or virtually impossible, for you to succeed under these circumstances.
The Merriday family, we had talked about them earlier, and it was interesting that the term that that Mr. Merriday used, where riots were coming, where people were rioting in front of the houses, throwing bricks, he referred to it as a flap.
A little flap.
Because understatement of what was going on, because he had become so numb to it because it happened so often. It was just a fact of life for a black family. So this is what you had to deal with. It becomes normalized. And he certainly wasn't trying to understate it. It was just, that's what we have to deal with on a regular basis.
So our next chapters, our last chapters, will be Chapter 11, looking forward, looking back, and Chapter 12, considering fixes. And then hopefully we will also be able to do a wrap-up, Michael, with you and I on the big takeaways from this book. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.